The moment my career supposedly ended happened in front of the entire team. We were standing in the conference room on a gray Tuesday morning when my manager Brandon Cole slammed a folder on the table hard enough to make the coffee cups rattle. Then he looked directly at me with the kind of confidence that comes from someone who has never been wrong before. "Claire's system access has been revoked," he announced to the room. "She's no longer part of this project." He let that land for a moment. Then he looked straight at me and said it. "You're finished here." The room went completely silent. People studied their laptops. Others stared at the whiteboard. Nobody looked at me directly, which somehow made it worse than if they had. I sat very still and kept my expression neutral. I stared at the laptop in front of me, the same laptop I had used for nearly 5 years to maintain the encryption system that protected the company's entire healthcare platform. Before I continue, we would like you to support our community and help us continue to creating high-quality content. We'd love for you to like, share, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement helps our videos reach a wider audience and inform our algorithm about the type of content you enjoy. If you'd like to stay up to date on our latest videos and be part of our growing community, please hit the notification bell. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to share more content with you in the future. Brandon thought locking me out meant it was over. But what he didn't understand was something very straightforward. The system he had just cut me off from still depended entirely on the encryption keys I was responsible for maintaining. And those keys could not simply be replaced overnight. 6 months before Brandon slammed that folder on the conference table, things were very different. I had been working at the healthcare software company for nearly 5 years. The official title on my badge said Senior Security Engineer, but that description never quite captured what I actually did. My job wasn't visible. Most of my colleagues couldn't have explained it in a sentence. I didn't give presentations or lead client calls or appear in the company newsletter. What I did was design and maintain the encryption framework that protected patient records across hundreds of hospitals. Every time a doctor opened a medical file or a lab transmitted test results or a hospital system backed up overnight, the security layer underneath that action ran on the architecture I had built and continued to manage. Quiet work. The kind nobody noticed unless something went wrong. And that was exactly how I preferred it. Then the company restructured 2 departments. Brandon Cole was brought in to lead ours. From the first week I could feel the shape of what was coming. Not all at once. Just small signals, the kind you notice when you pay close attention to systems and how they behave under pressure. Brandon arrived with energy and volume and a set of phrases he repeated so often they started to feel like wallpaper. Efficiency. Agility. Modernization. Speed to market. He gave a welcome speech that mentioned optimization 11 times. I counted because I was near the back and needed something to anchor my attention. The speech said almost nothing about what the department actually did. In the first 2 weeks he held individual meetings with every team member. Mine lasted about 20 minutes. He asked me to explain my role. I did. He nodded in all the right places and wrote things on a notepad. Then he asked me how long the security compliance process took for a standard software update. I told him the honest answer. Depending on the scope, anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. His expression shifted in a way I recognized immediately. Not curiosity. Not follow-up questions. Just a tightening around the eyes that meant he had filed my answer away as a problem rather than a fact. He thanked me for my time. I walked back to my desk with a quiet, settled feeling in my stomach. He didn't ask questions because he wanted to understand. He asked because he was building a case. The first real collision happened about 3 weeks after Brandon arrived. He had been pushing hard to accelerate a software rollout for a hospital network client. The timeline was aggressive, and he needed every team to move faster than our standard process allowed. He called me into his office. A security review that normally took 4 weeks needed to be compressed to 10 days and signed off as complete. I listened before responding. Then I told him clearly that compressing the review timeline as he described would bypass encryption compliance checkpoints required by federal healthcare data law. This wasn't a preference or a recommendation. It was a legal requirement. He stared at me for a moment. "We can document the risk and move forward," he said. "Other teams manage this all the time." I told him that wasn't accurate and explained why. He picked up his pen and tapped it twice against the desk. Don't make things complicated, he said. Then he told me to look at the problem differently and find a way to make the timeline work. I went back to my desk and wrote a memo documenting the conversation, the compliance requirement, and my response. I had no specific plan. I just knew a written record was worth more than a memory. A week after the compliance conversation, Brandon came to me with a different request. He wanted to grant his two closest project managers administrative override access to the encryption layer, so they could push updates through without waiting for security sign-off. I understood what he was trying to solve. He wanted speed, fewer bottlenecks, a team that could move without routing everything through my review process. The problem was that what he was describing wasn't a bottleneck. It was a safeguard. I explained this the same way I would explain anything technical to someone encountering it for the first time. Patient, clear, no condescension. The encryption system was not designed to allow administrative override at that level without a multi-stage approval chain. Bypassing it would create an unlocked access point. In a healthcare data environment, an unlocked access point was not a minor issue. It was a federal compliance violation. Brandon didn't argue with me. He simply nodded once slowly and said he would think about it. Walking back to my desk, I felt the weight of that nod. He wasn't considering my answer. He was deciding what to do next. And whatever he decided, it would not involve changing the timeline. Over the following weeks, the isolation started gradually enough that I almost convinced myself it wasn't deliberate. The first planning meeting I wasn't invited to, I assumed was an oversight. When it happened a second time, I sent a polite follow-up asking to be included, and received a vague response about keeping the initial session small. Then my weekly system status reports, which had always gone directly to senior leadership, were quietly rerouted through Brandon's review first. After that came the comments. I heard them secondhand from a colleague who sat near Brandon's office. He had started describing my security review process to other team members as overly cautious, as the reason projects moved slowly, as an inherited system that needed to be modernized. None of those things were accurate, but accuracy wasn't the point. Brandon was reshaping how the team thought about me before he made his actual move. He was making sure that when the moment came, the people in that room would already have been primed to see me as the obstacle and him as the solution. I recognized the strategy clearly. I had read about it in case studies, seen versions of it described in professional articles. What I hadn't anticipated was how cold it would feel to be on the receiving end of it. When I first designed the encryption architecture 4 years earlier, I built it with a specific principle in mind. Security systems are only as reliable as the people responsible for maintaining them. A technically perfect system managed by someone who doesn't understand it is far more dangerous than a simpler system managed by someone who does. So I built in a key stewardship process. The encryption keys that protected patient data rotated on a regular schedule. This was standard practice. What was specific to our system was the authorization layer on top of the rotation. Certificates renewed automatically, but only after the key steward reviewed and approved the rotation request. The approval wasn't a rubber stamp. It required the steward to verify the system state, confirm the rotation was occurring in the correct sequence, and sign off with access credentials that only the steward held. The process existed because automated key rotation without human verification had caused silent failures in other healthcare systems. I had read the postmortems carefully before designing our version. I had documented everything thoroughly in multiple places in the company's internal knowledge base. Brandon had been my manager for nearly 3 months. He had never asked how the key rotation worked. He had never opened the documentation. He had no idea the process existed. The final confrontation happened during a project review meeting on a Tuesday morning. Brandon had called the session to address delays in the hospital network rollout. He had a slide. The subject line was polite and professional. They had noticed some unusual behavior in the automated authentication tokens. Several had failed to renew on schedule. They wanted to understand if this was related to any system changes I had made before leaving. I read the email twice. Then I wrote a careful, professional response. I explained the key stewardship protocol. I described the authorization layer and explained that the rotation had reached the approval stage, which required credentials and access I no longer held following the termination of my system permissions. I kept my language completely factual. No frustration. No suggestion of what this might mean. Just the technical reality of the situation. I attached the relevant section of the system documentation. I hit send. Then I made a cup of tea and sat at my kitchen table for a while. The problems were going to get worse before anyone called the right person. By the following morning, 2 more emails had arrived. The first was from an IT team lead I had worked with for 3 years. His message had an edge of controlled urgency underneath the professional language. The authentication failures were spreading to connected systems. He wanted to get on a call as soon as possible. The second was from a project coordinator on Brandon's team. Politely worded, asking if I could spare 20 minutes to speak with one of their engineers about a technical question. I replied to both with the same core message. I was happy to help clarify anything I could. However, the issue they were describing was directly connected to the key stewardship authorization process, which required proper credentials and a documented transfer of stewardship responsibilities. That transfer had not been completed when my access was revoked. The solution was not a 20-minute phone call. The solution was a formal stewardship transition process carried out according to the documentation I had written, and that still existed in the company knowledge base. I gave them the exact file path. I kept my tone warm and cooperative throughout. What I did not do was offer to simply solve the problem quietly on my own, while the circumstances that had created it remained unchanged. 3 days after the key rotation deadline passed without authorization, the situation inside the company stopped being a technical inconvenience and started becoming a genuine operational crisis. Encrypted backup processes for several hospital clients began failing silently. The data wasn't being lost. The system had safeguards that prevented data loss. But the encryption cycle was breaking down in ways that slowed every secure file transfer across the network. Hospital integration systems that depended on our platform started reporting delays. Brandon's team was now working around the clock trying to understand what was happening. They brought in 2 external contractors to look at the system. Neither of them had any context for the key stewardship architecture because that documentation wasn't something a contractor would normally be handed on day one. I heard about this secondhand through a former colleague who messaged me quietly one evening. She said the team was frustrated and confused. Brandon was telling people the issue was a legacy system design flaw, that the previous approach had created unnecessary dependencies. I read that message sitting on my couch and felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, just a very tired kind of clarity. He still didn't understand what he had done. Brandon called me directly on a Wednesday evening. I recognized the number and let it ring twice before answering. I wanted that choice to be mine rather than a reflex. His tone was different from anything I had heard before. The authority was still there beneath the surface. But the confidence that usually carried his voice was thinner now, like a structure that still looks solid but has started giving in places. He told me there was a technical issue with the system and asked if I could walk one of his engineers through the key rotation process. I asked which engineer would receive the walkthrough and whether they had the access required. He said they were working on getting the right access. I told him the process wasn't simply a walkthrough. It was a formal transfer of stewardship requiring documented completion and specific credentialing. All of this was outlined in protocol documentation that had existed in the company system for 4 years. The silence on the phone lasted several seconds. I could hear him processing the gap between what he had assumed the solution would be and what I was describing. Then he said he would be in touch. The line went quiet. On the 4th day after the rotation deadline, 2 of the company's largest hospital clients sent formal communications to the executive team. I didn't see these directly, but the details reached me through 2 different channels within a few hours of each other. The clients were reporting performance degradation in their medical record systems. Encrypted file transfers that normally completed in seconds were taking minutes. Automated backup confirmations were failing to send. One hospital's overnight data sync had not completed successfully for 3 consecutive nights. In healthcare software, 3 consecutive sync failures is not a minor technical note in a weekly report. It is a serious contractual and regulatory concern. The executive team, I was told, had been in meetings for most of that day. At some point during those meetings, someone had pulled the original system architecture documentation. And somewhere in those documents, one name appeared consistently as the designer and maintainer of the entire encryption framework. My name, Someone in that room asked the obvious question. Where is she now, and why wasn't there a proper handover process completed before she left? I imagine that question landed like a stone dropped into still water, quiet at first, then ripples spreading outward in every direction. The internal audit began quietly but moved quickly once it started. A team from the compliance division was assigned to review the sequence of events leading up to the system failures. They pulled access logs, email records, meeting notes, and system change documentation going back 6 months. What they found in the logs painted a very clear picture. Multiple automated system warnings had been generated in the weeks before my access was revoked. Standard alerts that flagged the upcoming key rotation deadline, and noted that stewardship transition procedures should be initiated at least 30 days in advance. Those alerts had been delivered to the system administrator inbox, which Brandon controlled. None of them had received a documented response. The audit team also found the 2 compliance memos I had written. The one documenting Brandon's request to bypass the security review. The one documenting his request for unauthorized administrative override access. Both had been filed by me and timestamped accurately. Neither had generated a response or a counter-memo from Brandon. The picture that was forming wasn't a picture of a legacy system with design flaws. It was a picture of someone who had been warned repeatedly, in writing, and had chosen to ignore every warning. 2 days into the audit, HR contacted me again. The tone of this message was noticeably different from the early communications that had hinted at the possibility that my departure had somehow contributed to the situation. This was more careful, more formal, a request for documentation rather than an attempt to establish a narrative. They asked me to provide any records I had of communications related to the security review process during my time at the company. I had everything. Every email I had ever sent regarding compliance. Every reply or non-reply. Both formal memos. My original design documentation for the encryption framework. The key stewardship protocol in full. The automated alerts I had been copied on as system designer. Notes from every meeting where security compliance had been discussed. I had kept all of it. Not because I had planned for this specific situation, but because keeping thorough records was simply how I worked. You build things carefully and you document them carefully and you keep the documentation because systems are long-lived and memories are not. I organized everything into a single clearly labeled folder. Then I sent it. I didn't add commentary or framing or any suggestion of what it meant. I trusted the records to speak clearly enough on their own. On the same day I sent my documentation to HR. A senior infrastructure engineer named Patrick stepped forward during an internal technical review. Patrick had worked at the company for 7 years. He was not someone who made dramatic statements or volunteered opinions that hadn't been requested. He was the kind of person whose silence in a meeting usually meant agreement and whose words, when he chose to use them, carried weight precisely because he used them so rarely. He confirmed the encryption system had been functioning exactly as designed. He also confirmed the key stewardship protocol was not a legacy flaw or unnecessary dependency. It was a deliberate, well-documented security architecture decision built specifically to prevent the kind of silent failure now unfolding. He confirmed the standard procedure when a key steward leaves is a formal 30-day transition process. A process that had never been initiated at any point before my access was revoked. Patrick's statement didn't come across as an accusation. It came across as a technical clarification from a credible, neutral source. In the audit room, that clarification was as close to a verdict as anything short of a formal written finding. The narrative inside the company shifted completely in the hours that followed. By the end of the second week after my departure, the system had reached a state that leadership could no longer describe as a manageable technical issue. The key rotation that had not been completed was now overdue by 12 days. Systems that depended on the encryption cycle were operating in a degraded state. Secure hospital integrations were running on cached authentication tokens that were approaching their expiration windows. When cache tokens expire without renewal, access to encrypted data does not simply slow down. Stops. The engineering team working on the problem had isolated the exact mechanism. They understood what needed to happen technically. What they could not do was execute the solution, because executing it required the authorization credentials that belonged to the key steward. Credentials that were mine, not the company's property. not stored on a server somewhere waiting to be recovered. Generated specifically and held by the person designated as steward under the protocol I had designed. Brandon's team had spent 2 weeks looking for a workaround. There wasn't one. Not a safe one. Not a legal one. Not one that wouldn't require a full system rebuild that would take months and shut down hospital client access in the meantime. The only path forward ran directly through me. The call came on a Thursday evening. Not from IT. Not from HR. Not from Brandon. From the company's chief operating officer, a woman named Ruth who I had met twice briefly at company-wide events, and whose name appeared on the original contract I had signed when I joined. She introduced herself, which she didn't need to do, and thanked me for taking the call. Then she asked me directly if I would be willing to participate in an executive briefing the following morning to explain the encryption architecture and the path to restoring full system function. I told her I would be glad to. She thanked me again. After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a few minutes thinking about the difference between that phone call and the last conversation I had been part of inside that conference room. Brandon had announced my removal to a silent room of people looking at their laptops. Ruth had called me at home, introduced herself, and asked if I would be willing to help. The distance between those two conversations was not just a matter of tone. It was the difference between someone who understood what they were dealing with and someone who never had. The executive briefing took place by video call the next morning. There were 6 people on the call. Ruth, 2 members of the engineering leadership team, someone from the legal department, someone from compliance, and a senior vice president whose name I recognized from company communications, but had never spoken with directly. Brandon was not on the call. I walked them through the encryption architecture from the beginning, not because they needed every detail, but because I had learned over years that the best way to explain a complex system to people unfamiliar with it is to start from the foundation and build upward. That way they understand why each layer exists before they have to evaluate what went wrong with it. Key generation, rotation cycles, the authorization layer, the stewardship protocol and the reasoning behind it, the 30-day transition requirement, the consequences of bypassing that transition. As I spoke, the people on the call were quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet of the conference room when Brandon had made his announcement. This was the quiet of people taking notes and absorbing information and rearranging their understanding of the situation. When I finished, the compliance officer asked 2 precise questions. I answered both. Then Ruth thanked me and said someone would be in touch before the end of the day. The follow-up call came 3 hours later. It was the engineering lead, a calm and methodical person named, and who had been at the company for 8 years, and who I had worked alongside briefly on a compliance audit 2 years earlier. She walked me through the technical steps they believed were required to restore full system function. She asked me to confirm or correct her understanding at each stage. Her understanding was largely accurate. I made 3 corrections and 1 addition. Then she asked the direct question: would I be willing to complete the stewardship authorization as part of a formal documented process? I told her yes, with 1 condition. The condition was that the stewardship transfer be completed properly, with full documentation, with an identified and credentialed incoming steward who would take on the responsibilities going forward. Not a quick fix that restored function for now and left the same gap in place, and said she understood completely and agreed that was the correct approach. We scheduled the formal process for the following week. As I ended the call, I noticed something. Nobody during either of those calls had questioned whether the protocol I had designed was reasonable, or overly complicated, or a legacy problem that needed modernizing. They had only asked how to follow it correctly. After the executive briefing, Brandon stopped reaching out to me entirely. His name disappeared from the email chains I was now being copied on regarding the system restoration. The project coordinators who had been contacting me on his behalf stopped appearing in my inbox altogether. I didn't know exactly what was happening inside the company at that point, but the audit was continuing. A colleague sent me a brief message letting me know the compliance team had requested additional documentation from Brandon's office. Email records from the period when system warnings had been delivered, calendar entries from weeks before my access was revoked, records of any technical consultations he had conducted before initiating the personnel change. I didn't ask for details about what those records contained. I already knew what the timeline showed. I had lived through it. I I had documented it in real time as it was happening, not knowing exactly what I was building toward, just knowing that accurate records mattered. The audit would find what the audit would find. My part of the story was already written in the logs and the memos and the emails I had sent months before any of this came to a head. The formal investigation took 3 weeks. I was interviewed twice. Both sessions were conducted by the compliance team with a representative from legal present. The questions were detailed and specific. They asked about system design decisions, about specific conversations, about the content of the memos I had written and the responses or non-responses those memos had received. I answered everything accurately and completely. The engineering team conducted parallel technical interviews. Patrick participated again and provided detailed documentation of the system architecture review he had conducted independently. When the investigation concluded, the findings were distributed to the executive team and the board. I received a summary through the legal process rather than through internal communications, but the core finding was clear. The key stewardship protocol had been bypassed without completing the required transition procedures. System warnings regarding the upcoming rotation had been received and not acted upon. Compliance memos documenting security concerns had been filed and not addressed. The access revocation had been carried out without the technical preparation the system required. The conclusion drawn from these findings was not ambiguous. The system failures had resulted directly from a management decision that ignored documented protocol and disregarded repeated written warnings. The investigation did not name the decision as anything other than what it was. 2 weeks after the investigation concluded, Brandon was removed from his role. There was no company-wide announcement. There was no meeting where it was explained to the team. One morning he was there and the following Monday he was not, and a brief internal message was distributed saying the department would be operating under reorganized leadership while a search was conducted. I heard about it through the same quiet channel I had heard most things during those weeks. The colleague who sent me the message kept it simple. "He's gone," she wrote. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about the conference room, the folder hitting the table, the way the room had gone silent and everyone had looked at their laptops, the walk through the parking lot afterward with my bag over my shoulder, and 9 days on a clock that only I was aware of. I thought about what it must have been like to be Brandon in that final week. Understanding finally and fully that the thing he had dismissed as an obstacle was actually the foundation the entire system rested on. That the person he had called finished had been the one thing holding it all together. I closed my laptop and made dinner. About a month after the investigation closed, I returned to the office, not as a dismissed engineer trying to recover her former position, as the head of a newly formed security architecture team that reported directly to the chief operating officer. Ruth had made the offer personally during a meeting I had in her office the week after the stewardship transfer was completed. She had been direct about what happened and direct about what she was asking. She wanted someone in a formal leadership role whose job was to ensure that the gap between technical infrastructure and management decision-making never became that wide again. I accepted. On my first day back, I walked through the same lobby, past the same desks, through the same corridor. Some faces were new. Some were the same. The colleague who had given me the small sympathetic nod on the day I left caught my eye and smiled properly this time. I set my bag down at a desk that was now mine in a different way. The encryption system was running cleanly, keys rotating on schedule, everything underneath the platform working exactly as designed. Sometimes the person who built the foundation is the last one to learn things to ask, until the day the floor begins to shift.